It's strange how you can hear one sentence and suddenly realize you've been living in a completely different reality than the person you married. I remember the exact moment it happened. Susan was standing in the dark kitchen at 10:42 p.m., holding her phone in one hand and the unpaid electricity bill in the other, when Aaron laughed, not at her, into his phone. "Man, I'm telling you," he said, voice low but sharp. "She's been acting real suspicious lately." Susan didn't move. She probably got somebody else helping her now. The words didn't hit all at once. They settled slowly, like something breaking quietly instead of loud. Susan looked down at the bill in her hand, the one she hadn't paid on purpose, and for the first time since she got married, she wondered, who exactly did I build this life with? Welcome to Mr. Graham's family, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always give you the best as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from and subscribe to officially join the family. Atlanta had a way of teaching you early that nothing was guaranteed. Not time, not money, not people. Susan learned that before she ever had a paycheck. Her apartment sat on the south side, in a quiet complex where the buildings weren't new, but everything was kept clean out of pride, not pressure. The kind of place where neighbors noticed when your car hadn't moved in a couple days, and somebody's auntie always knew more than they said out loud. Inside, her place was simple, not empty, just intentional. The couch had taken her 8 months to save for. The dining table came from a second-hand shop, but she had sanded it down herself and stained it a warm brown that made the whole room feel softer. Even the throw pillows had been picked carefully. Nothing loud, nothing trendy, just things she could live with for a long time. Her mother used to say, "Don't fill your life with things you're going to regret looking at." Susan had taken that advice seriously, not just with furniture, with people too. Most mornings started the same way. Her alarm went off at 5:45, long before the sun fully settled over the city. She'd sit on the edge of the bed for a minute, not scrolling, not rushing, just waking up slowly, like she was giving herself permission to exist before the day started asking things from her. Then coffee, always coffee. She didn't skip steps in life. That was part of who she was. By 7, she'd be out the door, dressed neatly but comfortably. Nothing flashy, just put together. At work, she was the one people relied on without thinking twice. Project management at a healthcare firm wasn't glamorous, but it required something a lot of people didn't have: patience with other people's chaos. And Susan had plenty of that. "Hey, can you look at this real quick? Do you have a second? I don't know what I'm doing wrong here." She never said no, not because she couldn't, because it didn't feel right to. Helping people was normal to her. But the truth was, that habit didn't start at work. It started at home. Sunday dinners had always been loud. Her mother's house filled up early, pots already on the stove before noon, music playing low in the background, the smell of something seasoned just right drifting through every room. Her aunties moved through the kitchen like they were performing a routine they'd perfected years ago, talking over each other, laughing, correcting each other without ever really stopping. "You using too much salt. I've been cooking longer than you. Don't start. And that's why you're pressure high now." Susan would sit at the table sometimes, watching it all unfold, smiling without saying much. Her younger cousins would run in and out, loud and restless, full of stories nobody asked for but everybody listened to anyway. It was chaotic, but it was steady. It was the kind of environment where love didn't need to be announced. It showed up in plates being fixed for you before you asked, in someone remembering how you liked your food, in quiet check-ins disguised as jokes. "You eating enough? You look tired. You good?" Susan had grown up surrounded by women who carried everything, and they did it without asking for recognition. "Girl, you always got that same little calm look on your face," Denise said one Sunday, leaning back in her chair with a knowing expression, like nothing ever bothered you. Susan laughed softly, shaking her head. "Stuff bothers me. I just don't make everything a situation." Denise raised an eyebrow. "That's what I'm saying. You don't make nothing a situation. It's not that serious all the time," Susan replied, reaching for her glass. Denise leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel like the moment mattered. "Yeah, until it is." Susan didn't respond right away. She just smiled, the way she always did when a conversation got too close to something she didn't feel like unpacking. Denise watched her for a second longer, then sighed. I'm just saying, she added, softer now. Make sure somebody's doing for you the way you do for everybody else. Susan waved her off gently. I'm good, Denise. I promise. And at the time, she meant it, because the way Susan understood love wasn't loud. It wasn't in big gestures or constant reassurance. It was in consistency, in showing up, in handling things before they became problems, in making sure the people around you were okay, even if nobody stopped to ask if you were. That's how she loved. Quietly, fully, without keeping score. And for a long time, she believed that if you gave that kind of love to the right person, they'd recognize it, they'd return it, they'd meet you there. At least, that's what she thought before she met Aaron. The day she met Aaron didn't feel important while it was happening. It was just a Tuesday, one of those long, stretched-out workdays where every meeting ran over, every email felt urgent, and by the time it was done, Susan didn't feel accomplished, just drained. She almost went straight home. That's what she usually did on days like that. Quiet apartment, something simple for dinner, maybe a little TV playing in the background while she answered a few leftover emails. But something in her resisted that routine, not in a dramatic way, just a small thought, I don't feel like going straight home yet. So she turned off earlier than usual and pulled into a small coffee shop near Midtown. It wasn't one of the busy, crowded ones either, just a quiet place with soft lighting and a few people scattered around, working or pretending to exactly what she needed. She ordered something simple, found a small table near the window, and sat down with her phone still in her hand, staring at nothing in particular. For a few minutes, everything was quiet. No expectations. No one needing anything from her. Just stillness. Hey, excuse me. The voice came from her left. Susan looked up. Aaron was standing a few feet away, one hand resting on the back of a chair, the other holding his laptop like it had personally offended him. Do you know if their Wi-Fi ever actually works? He asked, a little awkward, like he wasn't sure if he should even be talking to her. Susan blinked once, then smiled faintly. Only when you don't need it. He paused, then let out a short laugh. Yeah, that sounds about right. There was something about the way he laughed. It wasn't loud or forced, just real, like he hadn't planned it. He glanced around, then back at her. Mind if I sit here for a second? I'm about 2 seconds away from throwing this thing, he said, lifting the laptop slightly. Susan shrugged lightly. Go ahead. He sat down across from her, setting the laptop on the table with a quiet sigh. I swear, I've been trying to send one email for like 20 minutes, he said, shaking his head. At this point, I'm about to just walk outside and yell it. Susan let out a small laugh. That might actually work faster. Right? He said, leaning back a little. At least somebody would hear me. There was a brief pause after that. Not awkward, just natural. I'm Aaron, by the way, he said, extending his hand slightly across the table. Susan. Her handshake was firm, steady. His was a little more relaxed. Nice to meet you, Susan, who knows the Wi-Fi struggle, he added with a faint smile. She shook her head, amused. I've spent enough time in places like this. You learn. Yeah, I'm still learning, he admitted. I just moved out here not too long ago. Atlanta? She asked. He nodded. Yeah, from the Midwest. That's a big change. You're telling me, he said, exhaling lightly. Everything's just faster here. People move like they got somewhere to be all the time. Susan smiled slightly. They usually do. And you? He asked. You from here? Yeah, born and raised. He nodded, like that explained something to him. That makes sense. What does that mean? She asked, raising an eyebrow slightly. He hesitated for a second, then shrugged. I don't know. You just seem settled. Susan leaned back in her chair a little. Settled. Not in a bad way, he said quickly. Just like you know what you're doing. Like you're not trying to figure everything out all at once. She considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod. I try not to make life harder than it needs to be. Aaron smiled at that. Yeah, I think I've been doing the opposite. The conversation stretched longer than either of them expected. What started as a quick complaint about Wi-Fi turned into something else entirely. They talked about work, his uncertainty, her stability, about family, his quiet upbringing, her loud Sunday dinners, about the difference between growing up where things were expected to stay the same and growing up where you learned early how to adapt. You ever feel like you're supposed to be doing more, but you don't even know what more is? Aaron asked at one point, his tone quieter now. Susan looked at him carefully. Yeah, she said after a moment, but I don't chase that feeling anymore. He frowned slightly. Why not? Because sometimes more is just pressure, she replied, not purpose. Aaron sat with that, really sat with it. Yeah, he said softly, that makes sense. At some point, Susan realized she wasn't checking the time anymore, wasn't thinking about emails, wasn't rushing to leave. And that wasn't normal for her. She noticed it, but she didn't pull away from it. Well, Aaron said eventually, glancing at his now closed laptop, I never did send that email. Susan smiled. Guess it wasn't that important. Or maybe I just needed a better distraction, he replied. There was a slight pause. Then he added, a little more carefully this time, would it be weird if I asked for your number? Susan looked at him, not surprised, just thoughtful. It wasn't the question that made her pause. It was how simple everything had felt up to that point. No pressure, no performance. Just conversation, not weird. She said finally, just depends what you plan on doing with it. Aaron smiled slightly. Probably try to see you again. She held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded. All right. When she walked out of that coffee shop later, the city didn't feel any different. Traffic still moved the same. People still rushed past. Nothing about Atlanta had changed. But something about her day had, and as small as that moment seemed at the time, it would end up being one of the few decisions she'd look back on years later and realize everything started there. At first, it felt easy. That's what Susan remembered most when she looked back on those early months with Aaron. Not excitement, not intensity, just ease. Their first few dates weren't anything elaborate. Dinner at places that didn't require reservations. Walks through parts of the city Aaron was still getting used to. Late-night conversations in her car when neither of them felt like ending the evening just yet. Aaron asked questions, real ones. Not the kind people ask just to respond, but the kind where you could tell he was actually trying to understand her. So you've always been this structured? He asked one night, glancing over at her as she drove. Susan smiled faintly. That's a nice way of saying predictable. I didn't say that, he replied, grinning. You meant it. He laughed. Okay, maybe a little, but it's not a bad thing. It's steady. She nodded once. That's the goal. Aaron leaned his head back against the seat, looking out the window. I think I've spent most of my life trying to figure things out as I go, he admitted. No real plan. Just moving. Susan didn't respond right away. She understood that kind of restlessness, but she had learned early not to build her life around it. Nothing wrong with figuring things out, she said finally, as long as you don't stay lost. Aaron turned his head slightly toward her. That's the part I'm still working on. There were differences between them. They didn't ignore that. Aaron had grown up in a house where things followed a clear structure. His father worked, his mother handled the home, and there wasn't much deviation from that. Roles weren't discussed, they were understood. Susan's world had been different. The women in her family didn't wait for anything. They worked, they provided, they spoke up, they made decisions. But early on, those differences didn't feel like a problem. They felt interesting, like something to learn from. You ever think about how you want your life to look long-term? Aaron asked one evening as they sat across from each other at a small restaurant, plates half finished between them. Susan shrugged lightly. I don't think about it like that. How do you think about it? I think about what I can build and maintain, she said. Something stable. Something that makes sense. Aaron nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I want that too. She looked at him for a second, not questioning, just observing. You think? She asked. He smiled, a little sheepish. All right, I know I do. I just haven't figured out how to get there yet. Susan didn't push. That was something she did often. She let people arrive at their own clarity. When things became official between them, it didn't come with a big moment. No dramatic declaration, just a quiet shift. More time together, more shared routines, less space between their lives. And eventually, No space at all. Marriage, for Susan, didn't feel like a leap. It felt like a continuation, like something that made sense. Aaron had been consistent enough, present enough, open enough, and Susan, being who she was, didn't wait for perfection. She believed in commitment, in choosing someone and building from there. In the beginning, they functioned well together. Emotionally, they felt aligned. They talked, they checked in, they showed up for each other in the ways that mattered, at least on the surface. And when Aaron hit a rough patch with work not long after they got married, Susan didn't hesitate. It happened gradually at first. A job that didn't work out, then another opportunity that wasn't the right fit, then a period of in-between that stretched longer than expected. Aaron didn't hide it, but he didn't fully explain it either. "I'm still figuring things out," he said one evening, sitting at the edge of the bed, running his hands together like he was trying to organize thoughts he couldn't quite finish. Susan stood near the dresser, folding clothes. "That's okay," she replied calmly. "We'll figure it out." He looked up at her. "You sure?" She nodded once. "I've got us." And she meant it. There was no hesitation in her voice, no resentment, no calculation, just certainty. From that point on, things shifted, but so subtly, it didn't feel like a shift at all. It felt like adjustment. Susan started covering more. At first, it was small things. Groceries, utilities, then rent, then everything. Not because Aaron asked, because she saw the gap and filled it. That's what she had always done. "You don't have to do all that," Aaron said once, watching her set down bags of groceries on the kitchen counter. Susan shrugged lightly, unpacking items without looking up. "It's not a big deal. I'm going to get it together soon," he added quickly. "I know you will," she said. And she believed him, not blindly, but willingly, because in her mind, this was temporary. This was what partnership looked like during hard seasons. One person holds things down while the other finds their footing. That's how she understood love. And in those early days, Aaron still met her emotionally. He listened. He laughed with her. He made her feel like they were building something together, even if the foundation wasn't perfectly balanced yet. That was enough for Susan, more than enough. Because what mattered to her wasn't who was doing more in the moment. It was whether they were moving in the same direction. And, at the time, it felt like they were. She didn't know yet that some imbalances don't stay temporary. They settle in. They reshape expectations. They change how people see each other. But back then, none of that was visible. Back then, it just felt like love. At first, nothing felt wrong. That's what made it hard to notice. There wasn't a moment where everything changed. No argument. No clear line between before and after. Just small adjustments that slowly became normal. Aaron was still figuring things out. That's how he phrased it. In the beginning, he said it with intention. "I've been looking at a few things," he would tell her, sitting at the edge of the couch, scrolling through his phone. "There's a couple opportunities that might work." Susan would nod, listening. What kind of opportunities? He'd explain, sometimes clearly, sometimes vaguely. A job lead here, a possible connection there. Nothing solid, but enough to sound like movement. And Susan didn't push. She trusted effort, even when results hadn't shown up yet. But over time, the conversations started changing. Not all at once, just little pieces missing. "I'm still figuring things out" became, "I'm working on it." Then eventually, it became nothing at all. One evening, Susan came home later than usual, her shoulders tight from a long day that had stretched past its limits. Her bag slipped from her shoulder as she stepped inside, keys landing softly on the table near the door. The apartment was quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. Aaron was sitting on the couch, controller in his hands, eyes locked on the screen. "Hey," she said, slipping off her shoes. "Hey," he replied, barely glancing over. There was no tension in it, but there wasn't much warmth either. Susan moved through the kitchen automatically, opening cabinets, checking what was there. They were low on groceries again. Milk, almost gone. Bread stale at the edges. A few random items that didn't quite make a meal. She paused for a second, hand resting on the counter. Then, she grabbed her keys again. "I'm gonna run to the store," she said. Aaron nodded slightly, still focused on the game. "All right. No." "You need help?" "No, I can go." Just acceptance. At the store, Susan moved through the aisles the same way she always did, quickly, efficiently, mentally tracking what was needed versus what could wait. She didn't linger, didn't treat it like an outing. It was a task, another responsibility. By the time she got back, Erin was in the same position, same couch, same focus, different level on the game. "Got some stuff," she said, setting the bags down. "Good," he replied casually. "We needed that. The word didn't sound wrong, but it didn't feel balanced either. That was how it started, not with anything loud, just small moments that didn't quite sit right, but weren't big enough to confront. Bills followed the same pattern. At first, Susan covered a few things while Erin got back on his feet. Then she covered most things. Then, everything. Rent came out of her account without discussion. Utilities were paid before the due date, like always. Her paycheck started stretching thinner, not dangerously, but noticeably. She adjusted, cut back on small things, delayed things she wanted for herself, told herself it was temporary. One night, she sat at the table with her laptop open, going over her expenses, numbers lined up in neat rows. Everything accounted for, everything handled. Erin walked in from the other room, glancing briefly at the screen. "You doing bills?" he asked. "Yeah," he nodded once, then walked past her toward the kitchen. No pause, no follow-up, no offer. Susan watched him for a second, not with anger, just awareness. "What you want for dinner?" he called out from the kitchen. She blinked once, then looked back at her screen. "I'll figure something out," she replied. "All right," he said, and that was it. No conversation about money, no check-ins, no acknowledgement of what she was carrying. But Susan didn't bring it up, because in her mind, this was still part of the same story she had already committed to. This is just a season. He's going to get it together. This is what partnership looks like sometimes. So she kept doing what she had always done. She handled things, quietly, consistently, without asking for anything in return. But something had changed, not in what she was doing, in what he had stopped doing, and the difference between those two things was starting to grow. It wasn't that Erin stopped being nice. That would have been easier to recognize. He didn't become harsh or aggressive. He didn't start arguments out of nowhere. He didn't even raise his voice much. He just settled. At home, his energy shifted first, not dramatically, just enough to feel different if you were paying attention. Susan started noticing it in small ways. The dishes would sit in the sink longer than they used to, not piled high, just there long enough to be noticeable. A plate from lunch, a cup from earlier, a pan left on the stove like it had been forgotten halfway through being cleaned. Before, Erin would have handled it without thinking. Now, it just waited, and eventually Susan would take care of it. Not because she was asked, because she noticed. Laundry followed the same pattern. Clothes that used to be folded together were now left in the basket, or worse, half done, washed, but not dried, dried, but not put away. Susan would walk past it once, twice, then finally stop, pick it up, and finish it, quietly, like she always did. "Hey, you seen my blue shirt?" Erin asked one morning, standing in the bedroom doorway. Susan looked up from her bag, already halfway dressed for work. "Which one?" "The one I wear sometimes. It's like navy." She paused, then walked over to the laundry basket, pulled it out from the corner, and started flipping through it. It was there, folded, but buried under other clothes she had finished the night before. She handed it to him. "Thanks," he said, already turning away. No pause, no realization, no acknowledgement that she had been the one keeping things running. That was the part that started to sit differently with her. Not the work itself, the silence around it. Even meals became assumed. Susan didn't cook every night, but when she did, she made sure it was enough for both of them. Something simple, but thoughtful. Something that felt like home after long days. Erin would eat. "Food's good," he'd say sometimes, but it felt automatic, like something you say out of habit, not out of appreciation. One evening she came home later than usual again. Her head was already full from work, deadlines, conversations, things that hadn't gone the way she planned. She stepped into the apartment and paused. The lights were on, the TV was playing. Erin was on the couch. There were empty takeout containers on the coffee table. Susan stood there for a second, taking it in, not judging, just noticing. "You ate already?" she asked. Erin glanced over. "Yeah, I was hungry." She nodded once. "Okay." She walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge. Nothing had been left for her. Not intentionally, just not considered. That was new. Susan closed the fridge slowly, leaning her hand against the door for a moment. She wasn't upset. Not exactly, but something about it didn't sit right. "You want me to grab you something?" Erin called out casually, like the thought had just occurred to him. She shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. "No, I'm good. I'll figure something out." Same word she always used. And she did. A quick meal. Something small. Something easy. She ate standing up at the counter, the way people do when they're too tired to make a moment out of something that used to matter. Later that night, she sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone without really seeing anything. Erin walked in, stretching slightly. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. He nodded. Didn't ask anything else. That was the other shift. The emotional one. He still checked in, but not deeply, not the way he used to. Before, he would have sat down next to her, asked what was wrong, waited for an answer. Now, it felt like a surface question, one that didn't require much of a response. And Susan gave him exactly that. Surface answers. Short replies, no complaints, no confrontation, because she wasn't trying to create problems. That wasn't who she was. But slowly, something inside her started to feel quieter, not peaceful, just less seen. She still showed up the same way, still handled things, still kept everything moving, but there was a growing space between what she gave and what she received, and for the first time, she felt it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make her pause, and then keep going anyway. Sunday dinner felt the same. That was the first thing Susan noticed when she walked into her mother's house that week. Same music playing low in the background. Same mix of voices overlapping in the kitchen. Same smell of something seasoned just right drifting through the hallway before she even took off her shoes. On the outside, nothing had changed, but she had. "You late," her mother called from the kitchen without turning around. "I know," Susan replied, setting her bag down. "Work ran over." Her mother said, not fully convinced, but not pushing either. "Go wash your hands." "Yes, ma'am." The house was full like always. Her aunties were already deep into their usual rhythm, half cooking, half debating something that had probably started hours ago. Her cousins moved in and out, laughing too loud, arguing over nothing that mattered. Susan slipped into it easily, smiling, listening, responding when spoken to. It was familiar, comforting, but Denise noticed her almost immediately. She always did. "You good?" Denise asked, leaning against the counter, watching her a little too closely. Susan glanced at her, then reached for a plate. "I'm good," she said lightly. Denise didn't move. "Yeah," she replied slowly, "you saying that a little too fast." Susan let out a small breath through her nose, half smiling. "I'm just tired." "That's it." Denise tilted her head slightly. "Tired? How?" Susan shrugged, reaching for a serving spoon just to have something to do with her hands. Work, life, same stuff. Denise didn't look convinced. They moved to the table a few minutes later, plates full, conversation flowing around them. For a while, it was easy to stay in the background, laugh when someone else said something funny, nod when someone told a story, blend in. But Denise wasn't done. She leaned over slightly, lowering her voice just enough to separate their conversation from the rest of the table. "So, what's going on with you and Erin?" Susan paused mid-bite. "Nothing," she said, too quickly. Denise raised an eyebrow. "Nothing?" "Nothing like that," Susan corrected, setting her fork down. "We're fine." Denise sat back in her chair slightly, studying her. "You sure about that?" Susan nodded. "Yeah." Another pause. Then Denise leaned forward again, quieter this time. "You don't seem like yourself." Susan looked down at her plate for a second, then back up. "I'm just busy," she said. "That's all." Denise didn't respond right away. She just watched her, and that silence was louder than anything she could have said. "Let me ask you something," Denise said finally. Susan sighed softly. already knowing this wasn't going to stay surface level. What? Denise folded her hands loosely on the table. Who's taking care of you? The question landed heavier than Susan expected, not because she didn't understand it, because she did. Immediately. I'm good, Susan said again, but this time it didn't come out as smooth. Denise didn't let it go. That's not what I asked. Susan shifted slightly in her seat. I don't need somebody taking care of me like that. That's not what I'm saying, Denise replied. I'm saying, you always the one holding everything together, making sure everybody's straight, making sure everything handled. She leaned in just a little closer. But who doing that for you? Susan opened her mouth to answer, then stopped, because for a second, she didn't have one. Aaron's good to me, she said finally, her voice steady but quieter now. Denise nodded slowly. I didn't ask if he was good to you. I asked if he's showing up. He is, Susan said, a little more firmly this time. He's just figuring things out right now. Denise leaned back, crossing her arms. How long he been figuring things out? Susan hesitated, just for a second, but Denise caught it. That's what I thought, Denise said softly. I got it, Susan added quickly. It's just a phase. Everybody goes through stuff. Denise didn't argue with that. She just nodded once. Yeah, she said. They do. Another pause. Then she added, quieter now. But phases ain't supposed to feel permanent. The conversation around them continued like nothing had happened. Someone laughed loudly at the other end of the table. A plate got passed around. Her aunt called out for someone to grab more drinks. Life kept moving, but Susan sat there for a moment, barely hearing any of it. Denise's words didn't feel dramatic. They didn't feel accusatory. They just stayed. You all right? Denise asked again, softer this time. Susan looked at her, then nodded slowly. Yeah, she said, and this time, she meant it a little differently, because for the first time since things started shifting, she wasn't just ignoring what she felt. She was noticing it. She just hadn't decided what to do with it yet. The thought didn't come to Susan all at once. It had been building quietly, in moments she didn't talk about, in pauses she didn't explain, in the space between what she was doing and what Aaron had stopped doing. It was a Wednesday night when the idea finally settled into something clear, not loud, not emotional, just certain. She was sitting at the dining table, her laptop open, the same way it had been so many nights before. Numbers lined up, bills listed out, rent, utilities, groceries, subscriptions. Everything accounted for the way she always kept it. Everything under control, everything on her. Aaron was in the living room, the TV low, something playing in the background that neither of them was really paying attention to. The apartment felt normal. That was the part that didn't sit right anymore. Susan scrolled through her expenses slowly, her face calm, but her mind sharper than it had been in weeks. She wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't frustrated. She was paying attention. Her cursor hovered over the electricity bill, due in 2 days. She stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, then leaned back slightly in her chair. A thought came up, not new, but clearer this time. What would happen if I didn't do it? She didn't move right away, didn't act on impulse. That wasn't who she was. Instead, she sat there and let the questions settle, not from a place of anger, from a place of curiosity, because for the first time, Susan realized something she hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge before. She didn't actually know what Aaron would do if she stopped holding everything together. She had never given him the space to show it. Not really. Every time there had been a gap, she filled it. Every time something needed to be handled, she handled it. Not because he asked, because she assumed responsibility before it ever reached him. So of course things worked. Of course the house stayed running. Of course life kept moving. But now, she needed to know something deeper than that, not what she was capable of. She already knew that. She needed to know what he would do. Would he notice? Would he step in? Would he care? Or would everything just fall on her again in a different way? Susan exhaled slowly, closing her laptop halfway but not fully shutting it. Her decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt controlled. I'm not saying anything, she murmured softly to herself. Not as a plan, as a boundary, because she knew if she brought it up, it would turn into a conversation, explanations, promises, temporary adjustments. She didn't want words. She wanted behavior. So she made a choice. Quietly, intentionally. For the next 30 days, she would stop paying for everything. No announcements, no reminders, no confrontations. Just space, not to punish him, not to prove a point, but to see the truth that only showed up when she stepped back. Susan leaned back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the table. There was no anxiety in her chest, no hesitation, just clarity. In the living room, Aaron laughed at something on the TV. Carefree, unbothered, Susan listened for a second, then looked back at the screen in front of her, at the bill she hadn't paid. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't fix it. The first few days felt normal. That was the surprising part. Nothing immediately fell apart. No dramatic consequences, no sudden realization from Aaron, no shift in behavior. Life just kept moving. Susan went to work like she always did, handled her responsibilities, came home, took off her shoes, set her bag down in the same spot. Aaron was still there. Same couch, same rhythm. If anything, he seemed more relaxed, like nothing had changed. The electricity stayed on. The water still ran. The apartment didn't feel any different. And for a brief moment, Susan wondered if maybe she had overthought everything. Maybe things weren't as unbalanced as they felt. Maybe she had just been tired. But then, the first email came. A quiet notification on her phone while she was sitting at her desk during lunch. Payment reminder, electricity bill due. She stared at it for a second, then locked her phone and set it face down on the table. That night, she didn't mention it, didn't hint, didn't check to see if Aaron had said anything. She just moved through the evening like she always did. Dinner was simple. Something quick. Aaron ate without comment. "You watched that show I told you about yet?" He asked casually between bites. "Not yet," she replied. "It's good. You'd like it. I'll check it out." And that was it. No mention of bills, no awareness of anything pending. 2 days later, another notification, past due notice. Susan saw it while standing in line at the grocery store. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She could pay it right there. It would take less than a minute. No inconvenience, no disruption. Everything would go back to normal. But she didn't. She put her phone back in her bag, stepped forward when it was her turn, paid for her groceries, and walked out. Back at home, she placed the bags on the counter. Aaron was in the living room again. "Hey," he said. "Hey, you get everything we needed?" "Yeah, good." Same pattern, same ease, same assumption. But something had shifted. Not outside. Inside, Susan started noticing more now. Not because things were louder, because she had stopped covering for them. The trash filled up faster than usual. Normally, she would have taken it out before it even reached that point. Now, it sat there, not overflowing, just waiting. Aaron walked past it more than once, didn't pause, didn't reach for it, didn't seem to register it as something that needed to be handled. Laundry sat longer. Groceries ran low in certain areas before she replaced them. Little gaps, small disruptions, nothing dramatic, but noticeable. One evening, Susan came home to find Aaron standing in the kitchen, staring into the fridge. "There's not really anything in here," he said, glancing back at her. She set her keys down calmly. "Yeah, I noticed." He frowned slightly. "You didn't go to the store?" "Not yet." There was a brief pause. Aaron closed the fridge slowly. "All right," he said, then walked back toward the living room. Susan stood there for a second, waiting, not for him to complain, just to see if he would act. He didn't. That was the moment something became clearer. It wasn't that Aaron didn't see problems. He did. He just didn't see them as his responsibility. And without realizing it, Susan had been reinforcing that every time she stepped in early, every time she handled something before it reached him, every time she made sure nothing ever required his involvement. Now, for the first time, things were reaching him, and he was stepping around them, not out of malice, not even out of defiance, just habit. That realization didn't make Susan angry. It made her quiet, because now she understood something she hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't temporary behavior. It was learned behavior, and she had been part of teaching it. That night, she sat on the couch beside him, the TV playing something neither of them was paying attention to. Aaron leaned back, relaxed. "You good?" he asked, glancing at her briefly. "Yeah," she said. He nodded, turned back to the screen, and Susan sat there, staring forward, her expression calm, because the cracks weren't loud. They weren't explosive, but they were real, and they were spreading. It happened on a Thursday, late afternoon, just as Susan was wrapping up work. Her phone buzzed once on the desk beside her laptop, then again, then a third time. She glanced at it, already knowing what it was before she even picked it up. Final notice, service interruption pending. She read it once, then again. Her face didn't change. For a brief second, her mind did what it had always done. Just pay it, fix it before it becomes a problem. Her thumb hovered over the screen. The habit was still there, strong, automatic. But then she remembered why she had stopped. Not to create chaos, not to prove a point, but to see what would happen when she didn't step in. So, she locked her phone, set it down, and finished her workday. By the time she got home that evening, the apartment felt different, not immediately obvious, just slightly off. Aaron was in the living room again, sitting forward this time, controller in his hands. The TV screen flickered, then went black. What the? He leaned back, pressing buttons. Nothing. Did the power just go out? He said, looking around. Susan stood near the doorway, setting her keys down slowly. "No," she said calmly. "Everything else is on." He glanced toward the kitchen. The lights were still working. He frowned. "That's weird." Susan walked past him, her movements steady, controlled. She didn't rush, didn't react, just observed. A few minutes later, Aaron grabbed his phone. "Internet's not working either," he muttered. He stood up, pacing slightly now, irritation creeping into his voice. "What is going on?" Susan leaned against the counter, arms loosely crossed. "I don't know," she said, and technically, that was true. She hadn't paid it, but she hadn't said anything either. Aaron tapped at his phone again, then let out a short exhale. "This is exactly what I mean," he said under his breath. Susan looked up. "What do you mean?" He turned toward her now, frustration no longer subtle. "Stuff like this just happens and nobody says anything," he said. Susan blinked once. "Nobody." Aaron gestured vaguely around the apartment. "The internet's off. Things not working. Like, what's going on?" There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. "I figured you'd handle it this month," Susan said calmly. The words landed, not loud, but heavy. Aaron's expression shifted, not into understanding, into confusion, then quickly, into something else. "What?" "I didn't pay it," she added, her tone steady. "I thought you might take care of it." He stared at her for a second, like he was trying to process what she had just said. Then his jaw tightened slightly. "So now I gotta do everything?" he muttered. The room went quiet. Susan didn't react immediately. She just looked at him, really looked at him. "Everything?" she repeated softly. Aaron shook his head, already defensive. "You know what I mean," he said. "Stuff like this. It shouldn't just be left like that." Susan let out a slow breath, not sharp, not emotional, just controlled. "It hasn't been left like that," she said. "I've been handling it. For months." Aaron shrugged slightly, like he didn't fully agree, or didn't fully want to acknowledge it. "Yeah, but now it's just off," he said. "Like, I don't even know what's going on." That sentence sat in the air for a moment. Susan tilted her head slightly. "You don't know what's going on," she repeated. He didn't answer, because the truth was, he hadn't been paying attention, and now that something had changed, his first instinct wasn't to step in. It was to question, to deflect, to feel inconvenienced. Susan pushed herself off the counter slowly. "I'll take care of it," she said. Aaron nodded once, like that was the natural resolution. "Yeah, just let me know next time," he added, already turning back toward the couch. "Let me know." Susan stood there for a second, then turned slightly, reaching for her phone. But she didn't open the bill, didn't fix it right away, because something had just become clear in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't confusion, it was expectation. And when that expectation wasn't met, it turned into blame. The argument about the internet didn't turn into a fight. That was the part that made it worse. It just settled. Aaron paid the bill the next morning. Not immediately, not urgently, just sometime during the day. By the time Susan got home from work, everything was back on. The TV worked, the Wi-Fi connected. The apartment looked exactly the same as it had before, but something underneath it had shifted. "Internet's back," Aaron said casually from the couch when she walked in. "Okay," Susan replied, setting her bag down. "That was weird," he added. "They shouldn't just shut stuff off like that." Susan paused for half a second, then nodded. "Yeah, he didn't mention that he paid it. Didn't say how much it was. Didn't ask about anything else." And Susan didn't ask either. They moved through that evening like nothing had happened. Dinner, TV, short conversations that didn't go anywhere. But something had changed in how Aaron spoke to her. Not directly, not in tone, in perspective. It showed up in small comments. The kind that don't feel like arguments, but don't feel right either. "She's been acting different lately," he said on the phone one night, pacing slowly near the window. Susan wasn't trying to listen, but she was close enough to hear. "I don't know," he continued. "Just distant. Not really the same." Susan stayed where she was, sitting at the dining table, her laptop open in front of her. Her fingers rested on the keyboard, not typing. "I've been trying to figure things out," Aaron added. "But it's like she not really supporting me the way she used to." Supporting me. The words didn't hit immediately. They settled slowly. Susan closed her laptop halfway. Not all the way. Just enough to stop pretending she was working. Aaron's voice dropped slightly, but not enough to miss. "Yeah. I don't know what's going on with her." With her. That was the first time Susan realized something she hadn't fully considered before. Aaron didn't see a problem with himself. He saw a problem with her. And more than that, he was starting to tell that story out loud. Not to her, to other people. The next time it happened, it was more obvious. He was on the phone with his mother. Susan knew the difference immediately. His tone shifted, softer, more familiar. "Yeah, everything's good," he said at first. Then, after a pause, "It's been a little weird lately." Susan stood in the kitchen, rinsing a plate slowly, her movement steady. "She just been, I don't know, not the same," he continued. "Like she got an attitude or something." Susan turned the water off, set the plate down. "She used to be way more supportive," Aaron added. "Now it's like everything's different." There it was again, supportive. But this time, it wasn't just a passing comment. It was a pattern. Susan leaned her hands lightly against the edge of the sink, staring down at nothing in particular. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was listening. Because what Aaron was doing wasn't just venting. He was building a version of the story. One where he was trying. One where things were happening to him. One where Susan had changed. And he hadn't. And the most unsettling part, he sounded like he believed it. "Yeah," he said into the phone, quieter now. "I don't know. Maybe she just going through something." Susan let out a slow breath. Maybe she was, just not in the way he thought. That night, Aaron came into the bedroom like everything was normal. "Hey," he said, pulling off his shirt, tossing it onto the chair. "Hey," Susan replied. He climbed into bed without hesitation, reaching for his phone, scrolling, relaxed. "You good?" he asked after a moment, not looking up. Susan paused, then answered the same way she always had. "Yeah," he nodded, didn't ask anything else. And just like that, the version of the story he was telling outside the house stayed unchallenged inside it. Not because Susan agreed, but because she was still deciding whether it was worth correcting. And, deep down, she was starting to realize something harder than anything she'd faced so far. It's one thing to be taken for granted. It's another thing entirely to be misunderstood, and that misunderstanding was starting to spread. Susan didn't go looking for it. That's what made it worse. It found her. It was a Friday evening, just after work, the kind of day that left her mentally drained, but not quite ready to go home yet. So instead of heading straight back, she stopped at a small restaurant she had been to a few times before. Nothing fancy, just quiet enough to sit, eat, and not think too much. She ordered something simple and sat near the window, her phone face down on the table, For a while, it was peaceful. "Hey, Susan?" She looked up. Tasha was standing there, hesitant, not smiling the way people usually do when they recognize you. "Tasha," Susan said, sitting up a little straighter. "Hey." They weren't close friends, more like mutual connections. People who crossed paths often enough to be familiar, but not enough to share personal details. "Can I sit for a second?" Tasha asked. There was something in her voice. Careful. "Yeah, of course," Susan replied, gesturing to the seat across from her. Tasha sat down slowly, placing her bag on the floor beside her chair. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just looked at Susan like she was trying to figure out where to start. "You all right?" Susan asked. Tasha let out a small breath. "Yeah, I mean, I don't know," she said, shaking her head slightly. "This is kind of awkward." Susan frowned slightly. "Okay." Tasha leaned in just a little, lowering her voice. "Look, I don't know what's going on between you and Aaron," she began carefully, "and I'm not trying to get in your business." Susan's expression didn't change, but her attention sharpened. "But he's been saying some things," Tasha added. There was a pause, not long, but long enough for something inside Susan to shift. "What kind of things?" she asked calmly. Tasha hesitated, then said it. "He's been telling people that you might be seeing somebody else." The words didn't land the way most people would expect. There was no immediate reaction, no shock on her face, no visible anger, just stillness. Susan blinked once, then leaned back slightly in her chair. "Seeing somebody else," she repeated. Tasha nodded slowly. "Yeah, I didn't want to believe it, but I've heard it more than once now." "From who?" Susan asked. Her voice was steady, controlled. "Just people around," Tasha said carefully. "Mutual friends, conversations. It's been coming up." Susan looked down at the table for a second. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge. "And what exactly is he saying?" she asked. Tasha exhaled slowly. "That you've been distant, acting different. That something's off." Susan let out a quiet breath. Not heavy, not emotional, just measured. "And that leads to cheating?" she asked. Tasha shook her head quickly. "I'm not saying it makes sense. I'm just telling you what he's been saying." There was another pause. Susan looked up at her. Her eyes were calm. Too calm. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Tasha met her gaze. "Because it didn't sit right with me," she said simply. "And I figured, if somebody was saying that about me, I'd want to know." Susan nodded once. "I appreciate that," she said. Tasha studied her for a second. "You okay?" Susan didn't answer right away, because the truth was, this wasn't about the rumor. It was about what it revealed. Aaron hadn't just misunderstood her. He hadn't just complained. He had crossed a line. He had taken a story that wasn't true and told it like it was. Not to her, to other people. "I'm good," Susan said finally, and for the first time. It didn't mean what it used to. Tasha nodded slowly, not fully convinced, but not pushing further. "All right. Just, yeah. I thought you should know." Susan gave a small nod. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment before Tasha stood up. "I'm gonna let you finish your dinner," she said. "Okay." And just like that, she was gone. Susan sat there alone again. Same table, same plate of food in front of her. But everything felt different. She picked up her fork, then set it back down, because suddenly, she wasn't hungry anymore. Not for food, not for explanations, not for anything that required her to question what she already knew. For months, she had been patient, understanding, supportive, and, in return, Aaron hadn't just taken that for granted. He had rewritten it, turned her into the problem, and said it out loud. That night, when Susan finally stood up and left the restaurant, she didn't feel emotional. She didn't feel angry. She felt something else, something quieter, something final. Because once someone is willing to lie about you, to protect their version of the truth, there's a part of the relationship that doesn't come back, and Susan could feel that part of it. Already gone. By the time Susan got home, the apartment was quiet. Not unusually quiet, just still. The lights were off, except for the soft glow from the living room. Aaron wasn't there. His shoes were by the door, but the couch was empty. The TV was off. No background noise. No movement. Susan stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. She didn't turn on any more lights, didn't rush to change clothes, didn't reach for her phone. She just stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. This used to feel like peace, a quiet apartment after a long day, a space where nothing was being asked of her. But tonight, it felt different. It felt honest. She walked slowly into the living room and sat down on the couch, her hands resting loosely in her lap. No TV, no music, just the faint hum of the city outside filtering through the window. For the first time in a long time, there was nothing distracting her from her own thoughts. She replayed the conversation with Tasha, not the words themselves, but what they meant. Aaron had told people she was cheating, not hinted, not questioned, told them. And what struck her most wasn't even the accusation. It was the ease of it, the way he had taken something that wasn't true and said it like it was, without coming to her, without asking, without even hesitating. Susan leaned back slowly, her head resting against the couch. Her eyes stayed open, focused on nothing. For months, she had been trying to understand him, his situation, his stress, his uncertainty. She had adjusted, given more, said less, waited longer. She had told herself, he's just going through something. He'll figure it out. This is temporary. But now, sitting there in the quiet, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to fully say before. This wasn't confusion. This was character. Aaron didn't just avoid responsibility, he redirected it. When things weren't working, it wasn't something to fix. It was something to blame. And when the situation didn't support his version of events, he created a new version, one where he didn't have to be accountable, one where she became the problem. Susan exhaled slowly, not heavy, not emotional, just steady, because the clarity didn't hurt the way she thought it would. It didn't feel like heartbreak. It felt like something settling into place, like finally understanding something that had been unclear for too long. She sat there for a long time. No clock, no urgency, just thinking, not about what she could fix, not about what she could say differently, not about how to make things work, but about what she had been accepting, and why. Her phone buzzed once on the table beside her. She glanced at it. Aaron, be home in a bit. Susan looked at the message for a second, then set her phone back down. No response. Because for the first time, she wasn't thinking about what he needed to hear. She was thinking about what she already knew. The version of him she had been holding on to wasn't the version standing in front of her now, and maybe it never had been. Susan leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. Her hands came together loosely. There were no tears, no anger, no dramatic realization, just a quiet decision forming, not rushed, not emotional, clear. Because at some point, you stop asking, how do I fix this? And you start asking, why am I still in it? The room stayed quiet. The city kept moving outside, and Susan sat there, no longer confused, no longer questioning, just done seeing things the way she used to. Aaron came home a little after 11. Susan heard the door unlock, then close with that same quiet click it always made. Keys on the table, shoes by the door. The routine hadn't changed. She was still sitting on the couch. Same position, same calm. Aaron walked into the living room, glancing at her briefly. You still up? He asked, a little surprised. Yeah. He paused for a second, like he was trying to read the room. Something about the quiet felt different. You good? He asked, dropping onto the couch across from her. Susan looked at him, not quickly, not emotionally, just directly. Aaron, she said, her voice even. Why are you telling people I'm cheating? The question didn't echo. It just landed. Aaron froze for a second. Not long, but long enough. What? He said, like he hadn't heard her correctly. Why are you telling people I'm cheating? She repeated. He leaned back slightly, his expression shifting, not into guilt, but into discomfort. I mean, he started, rubbing the back of his neck. You've been acting different. Susan didn't react. So that makes it okay to lie on me? She asked. Aaron frowned. I didn't say it like that, he replied quickly. I just said, things been off. People gonna assume what they assume. Susan held his gaze. You told them I was seeing somebody else. He shrugged slightly. I mean, you stopped supporting me. The words settled into the room. Susan blinked once, not out of confusion, out of recognition. Supporting you, she repeated slowly. Aaron leaned forward now, more defensive. Yeah. You been distant. You not doing what you used to do. Bills getting missed. Stuff just off, like, what am I supposed to think? Susan let out a quiet breath, then sat up slightly, her hands resting on her knees. What are you supposed to think? She said, Aaron, I've been carrying this entire house. For months. He shook his head immediately. See, that's what I'm talking about, he said. Now you trying to throw it in my face. I'm not throwing anything in your face, she replied calmly. I'm stating a fact. He leaned back again, exhaling sharply. Man, this is exactly why I said what I said, he muttered. Susan tilted her head slightly. Because I stopped doing everything for you. Aaron's jaw tightened. You acting like I wasn't going through something, he said, like I wasn't trying to figure things out. I gave you time. Susan replied. I gave you space. I gave you support. She paused, then added, but at some point, support turns into expectation. Aaron scoffed lightly. So now I'm just the bad guy? Susan didn't respond to that, because that wasn't the point. I didn't say anything, she continued. I didn't complain. I didn't argue. I just stopped. Aaron frowned. Stopped what? Carrying everything, she said simply. The room went quiet again, and instead of stepping up, she added, You told people I was cheating. Aaron looked away, just for a second, then back at her. You changed, he said. Susan nodded once. I did. Another pause. Aaron leaned forward again, his tone sharper now. But that's what a wife does, he said. You hold things down when your husband going through something. The sentence landed. Heavy, final. Susan didn't speak right away. She just looked at him, really looked at him. Not the man she met, not the man she believed in, the man sitting in front of her now. And in that moment, everything connected. The silence, the expectation, the blame, the lies, it all pointed to the same thing. Not misunderstanding, entitlement. Susan stood up slowly, not rushed, not dramatic. I'm done, she said. Aaron blinked. What? I'm done, she repeated, her voice calm but firm. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. All right. Come on, don't do that, he said. You just mad right now. Susan didn't move. I'm not mad, she replied. And that was the part that made him pause. Because she didn't sound mad. She sounded certain, and that was something he hadn't heard from her before. Aaron didn't believe her at first. That was clear the next morning. He moved around the apartment like nothing had really changed. Got up late, walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, closed it, stood there for a second like he was thinking about something, then grabbed his phone instead. You still going to work? He asked casually when he saw Susan getting ready. She was at the mirror, buttoning her blouse. Yes, he nodded. All right, no mention of the night before, no follow-up, no acknowledgement. To him, it had been an argument, something that would pass, something she would calm down from. Susan picked up her bag, walked past him, paused for just a second at the door. I meant what I said, she added. Aaron looked up from his phone, half annoyed, half dismissive. Yeah. Okay, he said. We'll talk later. But Susan didn't respond. She just left. That was the last time she tried to make sure he understood. After that, she moved differently, not dramatically, just intentionally. She called a lawyer during her lunch break. The conversation was straightforward, clear, efficient. What are you looking to do? The lawyer asked. I want to file, Susan said. There was no hesitation in her voice. All right, the lawyer replied. We'll walk through everything step by step. And that's exactly what they did. Paperwork, timelines, assets, responsibilities. Susan listened, answered questions, provided what was needed. She didn't rush, didn't stall, didn't second guess. She just followed through. At home, Aaron started noticing the shift. Not immediately, But gradually, Susan wasn't filling in the gaps anymore. Not financially, not emotionally, not conversationally. She spoke when necessary, answered when asked, but she didn't extend herself the way she used to. "What's been going on with you?" he asked one evening, leaning against the doorway while she sat at the table going through documents. Susan didn't look up right away. "Nothing," she said calmly. He frowned. "That's not true," he replied. "You've been acting different." She glanced up at him briefly. "I told you I was done." Aaron let out a short breath, running his hand over his face. "You keep saying that like you serious," he said. Susan looked back down at her papers. "I am." There was a pause, longer this time. Then his tone shifted. "All right, so what does that even mean?" he asked, his voice tighter now. "You just gonna walk away?" Susan set the paper down slowly, then looked at him. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer caught him off guard. No conversation, no trying to fix it. He pressed. Susan held his gaze. "I've been trying," she said, just not out loud. Aaron shook his head, frustration creeping in. "Man, you acting like I did something crazy," he said. "It wasn't even that serious." Susan didn't react, because for her, that was the confirmation, the fact that he still didn't see it. "You told people I was cheating," she said. "I said you was acting different," he corrected quickly. "People took it, how they took it." Susan didn't argue. There was nothing left to explain. Days passed. Then, a week. The paperwork moved forward. And eventually, Aaron was served. That was the moment it became real for him. He called her immediately. "Susan, what is this?" he asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "You know what it is," she replied calmly. "You actually filed?" He said. "You serious right now?" "Yes." There was a pause. Then his tone changed completely. "Susan, come on," he said, softer now. "We don't gotta do all this." She didn't respond. "I didn't mean it like that," he added quickly. "I was just talking. I was frustrated." "Still nothing. I can fix this," he continued. "I just needed time." Susan closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "I gave you time," she said. Another pause. "I just need another chance," he said. And there it was, not accountability. Another request. Susan leaned back slightly in her chair. "I'm not asking you to change," she said calmly. Aaron frowned. "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying I see you clearly now." The line went quiet. Because there was nothing to argue with, nothing to defend, nothing to negotiate. And for the first time, Aaron realized something he hadn't expected. Susan wasn't reacting. She had already decided, and that was something he couldn't control. The first Sunday back at her mother's house felt familiar in a way Susan hadn't realized she missed. Not dramatic, not emotional, just steady. The screen door creaked the same way it always did when she pushed it open. The smell hit her before she even stepped fully inside. Something slow-cooked, something seasoned deep, something that had been made with time, not urgency. Voices filled the space. Laughter layered over conversation. Someone arguing about something small like it mattered more than it did. "Hey, baby," her mother called out from the kitchen without turning around. "Hey," Susan replied, setting her bag down in the same spot she always had. Nothing about this place had changed, and for the first time in a long time. She didn't feel like she had to hold anything together. Her aunties were moving around the kitchen, passing things back and forth, correcting each other mid-sentence like it was part of the recipe. "You done already put that in there?" "I was about to." "No, you wasn't. Move." Susan smiled faintly, leaning against the counter for a moment, just watching. "Look who decided to show up," Denise said, walking in with a glass in her hand. Susan turned slightly. "I've been coming," she replied. Denise gave her a look. "You been physically coming," she said. "That ain't the same." Susan exhaled softly, a small smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "Fair." Denise stepped closer, studying her face for a second. Not in a dramatic way, just checking. "You okay?" she asked. Susan nodded once. "Yeah." This time, it didn't feel like a deflection. Denise seemed to notice. Her posture relaxed just a little. "Aight," she said. "Good." They moved toward the table as plates started filling up. The usual rhythm took over, passing dishes, talking over each other, laughing at things that didn't need context. Susan sat back in her chair, her plate in front of her, her hands resting lightly on either side of it. She didn't rush to eat, didn't jump into conversation, she just took it in. "You quiet today," Denise said after a while, nudging her lightly. Susan glanced at her. "Just listening." Denise raised an eyebrow. "That's new." Susan smiled. "Not really. I just don't feel like I gotta say anything right now." Denise leaned back slightly, watching her. "That's a good place to be," she said. Susan nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The conversation around them continued like always, loud, overlapping, full of life. Then Denise leaned in, just a little. "So," she said, "what you learn?" Susan let out a small breath, not heavy, not emotional, just thoughtful. She looked down at her plate for a second, then back up. "I learned that love isn't quiet just because it's real," she said slowly. "And it's not supposed to feel one-sided just because you're strong." Denise nodded once, listening. "I thought if I kept showing up, kept handling things, kept being patient," Susan continued, "it would eventually balance out." She paused, but all it did was make it easier for him not to show up at all. Denise leaned back slightly, her expression serious now. "Yeah," she said, "that happens." Susan rested her hands together loosely. "I also learned that just because somebody needs time doesn't mean you owe them unlimited access to yours." Denise let out a quiet breath through her nose. "Say that again." Susan smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I'm just not doing that anymore," she said. Another pause. Then Denise asked the question that mattered most. "You miss him?" Susan didn't answer right away. She thought about it, honestly, then shook her head slightly. "I miss who I thought he was," she said. Denise nodded slowly. "Yeah," she replied. "That part always harder." Susan leaned back in her chair, her shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been in a long time. There was no tension in her chest, no need to explain herself, no pressure to carry more than what belonged to her. Just space, real space. And in that space, something settled. Not anger, not regret, understanding. Because the hardest part hadn't been leaving. It had been accepting the truth while she was still there, accepting that the person she loved wasn't showing up the way she needed, and more importantly, wasn't trying to. Susan picked up her fork finally, taking a bite of food that tasted like something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Denise nudged her again lightly. "You smiling now," she said. Susan glanced at her, a quiet calm in her eyes. "Yeah," she replied. Then, after a brief pause, she added, "Because I finally understand something." Denise raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Susan looked down at her plate for a second, then back up. "Love isn't proven by how much you can carry for someone," she said. "It's proven by what they're willing to carry with you." Denise sat back, letting that sit. "Yeah," she said quietly. "That's the one." Susan didn't add anything else. She didn't need to, because for the first time in a long time, that truth didn't feel heavy. It felt freeing. If this story hit you in any way, I want you to be honest with yourself for a second. Have you ever been in a situation where you were giving more than you were receiving, and you kept telling yourself it was just temporary? If you've experienced something like that, drop a comment below. You never know who might read your story and feel less alone. And if this message spoke to you, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're building a space here where real stories actually mean something, and I'm glad you're a part of it.